Well, welcome everyone to Wednesday afternoon. I have the wrong background on my screen, but you can't see it, so that's all right. Um, but basically, welcome to another one of these serious security seminars. And very pleased today to have Jeff Mann with us. I've known Jeff for many years, and he has a very large set of experiences and expertise that he brings to bear in the area of cybersecurity. He is one of the first people to be involved at NSA on a red team, and he may come back and give us a talk about that experience on the future. He's had some interesting experiences there, but also out in industry, he's worked both offense and defense on securing systems. He's been profiled in print a number of times for the work that he does. He has a podcast, and there's just so many different things about him that are worth mentioning. Check out his bio online, and I'm going to turn it over to him because he's going to have some interesting things to tell us about why attack when you can defend. So Jeff, we're very pleased to have you. Please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Spath, for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to present here at the seminar today. Very much appreciate it. As mentioned, my name is Jeff Mann. I'm known by some as Mr. Jeff Mann because I'm old, and it happens to be my Twitter handle. You can see my contact information here. And please feel free to reach out to me. I'm very serious about that. If you have questions, if you want to bounce ideas, if you're, looking for advice in a mentoring type of way, I'm happy to share my opinion. That's one of the things I'm known for, which is one of the reasons why I've been fired so many times, I guess. But I think I repeat this at the end, so don't think you have to capture it. And mostly I repeat it at the end. Like, if you still want to talk to me after you've heard my presentation. Spath mentioned I've been in the industry a long time. I am starting to round up to say 40 years. I claim the first type of thing I did as a hacker, sort of from a cyber security perspective, which we didn't call it that back then. But I go back as far as 1982. So at this point, I'm rounding up. My formative years were working for the Department of Defense. I actually worked for the Navy a couple years before I ended up at NSA. I was there for 10 years. I was actually initially a cryptanalyst, and I was working on what was called at the time the InfoSec side of the world. So it was the defensive side of NSA's mission. And I did work with what was called at the time manual crypto systems, so good old-fashioned codes and ciphers and secret writings and things like that. Primarily in those days, it was one-time pads. I've been in private industry for about 25 years now, initially doing security assessments, vulnerability assessments, security architecture. Back in those days, it was getting companies onto the internet, and how are you going to do that securely? How are you going to take your isolated network and plug into, which at the time was depicted on most Visio drawings or line diagrams. The internet was depicted as the cloud, and of course now the cloud has been co-opted and it's the thing. There's a book series called Tribe of Hackers. That's the book where I've actually contributed. There's actually 4 in the series. There's Tribe of Hackers, what they call the original. There's one that focuses on red team, one that focuses on security leaders, and one that focuses on blue team. And I actually contributed to all 4 of the books. One of only 2 people that did that. I've also been affiliated with Security Weekly. The main show is Paul Security Weekly. I've been doing that for about 6 years, and just celebrated our 1st anniversary. I'm the host of my own show called Security and Compliance Weekly. Not to dwell too much on my background, but Spath mentioned that we go back a few years. I'm actually one of the members of what Spath has coined the cabal of the curmudgeons, which are old timers, people that have been around the block a few times, seen it all, done it all, are pretty much bitter and cynical, to one degree or another, but we haven't completely given up hope. And as a teaser to the story that I'll tell hopefully in person sometime in the future, I'll tell the story of the beginnings of the Red Team at NSA, which necessarily involved working with the lawyers, what the military calls the General Counsel. Of course, I got in trouble, and that's sort of the essence of the story. And ironically, when I was indoctrinated into the group of the Cabal of the Curmudgeons, the person that sponsored me was the lawyer that I'd gotten in trouble with many years ago, a gentleman named Rich Marshall, who I happen to have my arm around in this picture. But enough about me. I want to move on to the topic at hand. What are we talking about today? I'd like to begin my talks with level setting. So I want to go over very briefly some terminology. It should be terms that you're familiar with, but if you've spent any time in the industry, you may have noticed that sometimes these terms are kind of bandied about, sometimes synonymously, sometimes, in my opinion, and perhaps your opinion too, incorrectly, or at least not completely understood, at least the way I learned it, which I'll get to in a moment, about how they all work together. But the topic primarily today is the Mitre attack framework and also PCI. PCI, I've been working in specifically in the PCI space, which is the payment card industry, which is the security of credit cards and debit cards, at merchants and retailers and all the companies that support that process, which are called service providers. I think I was first introduced to the Mitre attack framework at various times on the Paul Security Weekly podcasts. We have different companies come in and talk about their products and solutions. And in the last year or two, Mitre attack framework comes up a lot. And we had a presentation, time is such a blur these days. This was probably about a year ago, episode 612. We had on with us somebody from Mitre, a woman named Katie Nichols, who actually doesn't work at Mitre anymore, but she did an in-depth dive of the Mitre attack framework. So that was my first indoctrination into it. And it piqued my interest because I'm always looking for things of how to solve this puzzle of, how do you get companies to be secure? How do you get companies to implement appropriate security into their enterprises, large and small? And despite all of our best efforts, barely a day or a week goes by where there isn't some major breach reported in the news. And every time I see that, I keep thinking we as an industry are failing. So I'm always trying to find a way to do it differently, to do it better, and try to come up with something that's going to work for everyone. I mentioned I want to go over briefly the terminology, and to level set, when I first started learning what we now know as cybersecurity, I learned it within the DoD at NSA, and I was first introduced to what's called the basic risk equation. Now, you may be familiar with risk equations. If you Google it, you can find dozens, if not hundreds, of various organizations and people's attempts to come up with a risk equation that produces some sort of value. And very roughly speaking, the idea is you have all these forces in play and they're all combined together somehow algorithmically to produce a risk value. So the risk equation at the end of the day is a value measurement of how well you're doing security, but how well ultimately you're protecting the things that you care about in your organization. I use this very simplified diagram because I'm not a mathematician and I don't want to get wrapped around the axle, but essentially risk is a function of, and this is the terminology that I learned some 30-ish years ago, of vulnerabilities, threats, and countermeasures. You have some number of vulnerabilities, you have some number of threats, you try to reduce them or mitigate them by countermeasures. Notice that security is not even mentioned in this equation, but for the benefit or for the purpose of our discussion, you can think of countermeasures as being the security stuff. My source for this terminology, and I think you can find this document out on the internet. I actually have an older version than this one, but what we refer to as the InfoSec glossary, and it's about a ½ inch thick document that was probably originally typed. The copy that I have might have been printed, but probably by an offset press. And the terms that I want to just very briefly share with you are sort of the dictionary definitions of the terms. So very briefly, and I won't read this to you, but risk essentially, as I said, is the measure, the value that you ascribe to whatever it is that you worry about. And overall, the goal is you want your risk to be lower, reduced, probably never eliminated, but reduced to a level that you're comfortable with. Threat is an interesting term, because threat, the way I used to know it, the way I was taught it back in the DoD, was essentially the bad guy. It was the who's going to do something to you, the people, the organizations, the nation states that want to do bad things to you. Keep in mind that, this is national security stuff, national defense, the way I learned it. The term has evolved, and while I always or often try to emphasize, no, it's really the people behind the things. Threat has come to be sort of recognized as what I would have called the attacks, but the things that the bad guys do to try to exploit your networks, your enterprises, and your systems. Vulnerabilities, of course, is the majority of our industry, it seems, focused on vulnerabilities. I simply describe or think of vulnerabilities as a weakness, and the weaknesses are not just in the systems, the applications, but in particular, and this is something that's lost on a lot of people. I'm going to close the blind real quick so you don't think I'm God. Wasn't factoring in the time of day. I apologize. Vulnerabilities can be in processes. Vulnerabilities can be in terms of behaviors, business practices, business functions, and so on and so forth. Not just strictly system vulnerabilities or application vulnerabilities. And then, of course, finally, countermeasures. Countermeasures are the things that you do to try to, as I said earlier, mitigate or reduce the impact of the fact that you have vulnerabilities and threats in your environment. So just a real brief introduction. You probably had this in a 100 level course already. So let's get into it a little bit. I don't know how much you're already familiar with the Mitre attack framework, so I apologize if this is retreading old ground, but just in case that you're not terribly familiar with it, I want to just give you a very brief introduction of what the Mitre attack framework is all about. This is the definition that appears on the Mitre attack website. So, this is their idea of what the purpose of the attack framework is. In essence, I think it's a very reasonable and interesting and intriguing approach to try to systematically figure out what the bad guys, what the attackers, what the threats, or sometimes we call them threat agents these days, do to you. And what's interesting about this at a high level is that it's based on real world activities. It isn't hypothetical. It isn't somebody whiteboarding what could go wrong. It's what is being seen as being done in the wild. And that alone, I think, is enough to focus and pay some attention to the attack framework. This is various snippets of different companies that I found that try to describe what the Mitre attack framework is. And these are companies that, like I said, would come on the podcast and talk about how the Mitre attack framework, how they're using it to measure the effectiveness of the security products and tools and solutions that they provide, things like that. A couple more verbose descriptions of it. read that for a moment. This is being recorded. You can always go back later and look at it, or just Google Mitre attack and see what people are saying. But again, the way I was introduced to it is mostly from a vendor perspective and how the Mitre attack framework can be built into or used to measure the effectiveness of their products, or built into the methodologies that go behind some of the products, particularly in the areas of anomaly detection, intrusion detection, and things like that. The way that the attack framework is organized, and one of the things I don't like about it, is you can't really put it on a single pane of glass. You can't just see the whole thing all at once. But they've taken all the different things that happen and they've categorized them into what they call tactics. And so they have this series of 11 tactics, and then for each tactic, they list some of the what they call techniques that are associated with a particular tactic. So essentially, what is the bad guy doing and why are they doing it? The why falls under, or they put it under, a category of tactic. This is just another view of the tactics themselves, a more concise list that's perhaps easier to read through. And if you have any experience in doing red teaming or blue teaming, these should be somewhat familiar terms to you. The techniques, and I apologize, this is a somewhat dated slide because sometime in the last couple months, the Mitre is reorganized. So at the time I put this presentation together and did the research, they had 266 documented techniques. I think the number now is somewhere up in the 500 or 600 range. And I apologize for not updating the slides. But it would require me to do more research that I haven't had the time to do. But essentially what they've done is they've taken their 266 techniques and further broken them down into subcategories. So techniques that sort of support one of the major 266 techniques. The tactics are still, there's still 11 major tactics. There's just a few more hundred techniques that are, or sub-techniques as it were, that they've identified and now are detailed in the attack framework. And then what was most interesting to me is they actually tell you how to fix the problem. They tell you what to do to mitigate the different techniques that are associated with the tactics. And again, that number 41 mitigations, that is still the same number. So that part of it hasn't changed. Some of the other things that they do is they actually keep track of actual groups that have been identified as bad guys, attackers. Some of these are nation states. Some of these are hacker groups that are doing various things. Obviously popular these days is ransomware. So they've identified and they map for a various APT or a particular APT. They keep track of what are these guys doing, what do they like to do, what are their tendencies, and they've identified that, and that's something that they also track within the framework. They also do, and they say they're not really bake-offs, but you can think of it as a bake-off. But they will set up scenarios like they'll take. In this case, they picked a particular APT, and they invited a lot of different vendors to come into sort of a controlled environment, and they executed and they emulated the tactics and the techniques of this particular APT, and they let all the different vendors that participated run their systems and see how well they did at detecting the activity, thwarting the activity, blocking the activity, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of very briefly in a nutshell what Mitre attack framework is about, at least at a basic level. Now, when I first heard about it, what I started thinking about, because I have PCI on the brain because I've been doing it for so long, was, okay, you've got all these different attacks, you got all these different techniques. My immediate focus was, okay, but how do you fix it? Why don't you just cut to the chase? That's sort of the nature of the title. Why attack when you can defend? Why not let's focus on fixing the problem? And in the context of the PCI data security standard, my sort of initial hypothesis was, I'll bet you for all the techniques that they've identified, and in particular, all the mitigations that they say, these are the things you need to do to fix the problem or eliminate the problem, or at least set you up to be able to detect that the things are happening. I bet you all those mitigations already exist within the PCI data security standard. Now, if you're not familiar with the PCI data security standard, it was first published in 2004. So it's been around 16, 17 years. And at a very high level, it represents 6 goals of what should be in a security program within an organization. And that is broken down into 12 major requirements that they call it. Within those 12 major requirements, there are hundreds of sub-requirements that detail the elements of these 12 requirements. We could probably have a whole discussion around whether this is a complete list or not. I would submit to you that where I'm coming from, given my background, that more or less for all intents and purposes, this doesn't change. The elements of a security program, the activities or goals at a high level really don't change. Obviously, the technology has changed over the years, and how you accomplish and meet these various security requirements certainly changes with the way the technology has changed. But at a high level, I think these are pretty solid, and they stand up pretty well. And my proof point, I guess, is the fact that PCI is still out there and is still a major force within this industry. Just ask a company that has to go through the compliance process and validate that they're doing all the things that PCI requires. So my idea was I want to actually sit down with the Mitre attack framework, look at all the mitigations, and actually map them to the PCI data security standard to see if what Mitre says is what you need to do to fix the problem already exists within this particular framework, as it were. And if you were following the framework right out of the gate, you'd be doing pretty well to defend against the real world attacks that are being used by real bad guys, that is reflected in the fantastic work that Mitre has done in putting together this attack framework. Now, at first blush, there's a couple requirements that kind of jump out at you from the PCI data security standard that would seem to intuitively make sense, that the Mitre attack framework, because it is something that talks about red teaming and blue teaming activities, either performing the activities, but more importantly, defending against them. Penetration testing is one requirement within PCI, and there's a requirement for both an internal and an external penetration test to be performed at least once a year. And it's supposed to cover both network level penetration testing as well as application level penetration testing. And as I said, there's a lot of sub requirements that tie into those, but at a high level, that's what is required. Also, there's a requirement for performing an annual risk assessment, which is designed to, on an annual basis, sort of review how you've done over the previous year, make sure you've kept everything up to date in terms of standards and procedures, make sure your inventory is up to date, and tying in lessons learned, tying in any incidents that might have happened, tying in changes in your environment, changes in the world, what the bad guys are focused on, what are the prevailing attacks, and especially the ones that might target your type of organization. So from that perspective, sort of a measuring perspective, I thought, that probably makes sense as well. And then finally, of course, incident response, the ability to actually detect and respond to the bad things that happen. It seems like the attack framework would fit into that in some manner. So again, my focus was on looking at the 41 mitigations, and I mapped them out in a spreadsheet. And for every one of them, I started writing down which requirement that I thought satisfied or addressed is probably the best word to use, the particular mitigation. So my spreadsheet had the mitigation, a short description of the mitigation as Mitre provides, and then I added to my spreadsheet the particular PCI requirement with the high-level description of what it is. I very quickly discovered as I was reading through the mitigations that very often more than one PCI requirement might be said to address the particular mitigation. So I ended up, making 3 columns. I could probably have gone further than that in some cases, but 3 seemed to be a good number. So I mapped each of the 41 mitigations up to 3 different PCI requirements. So that's a spreadsheet that I have, and that's the essence of my work. And I would be happy to share with anyone the spreadsheet if they want to continue this project, especially if they want to tackle the 500 or 600 now techniques and sub-techniques that Mitre's put forth in the last couple months. So having done that, with my hypothesis being, how well does it map? I want to share with you my results. The Kobayashi Meru, if you are not familiar, is a concept that comes out in the movie Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, and the idea that the unbeatable scenario, Captain Kirk, the Star Trek hacker, figured out a way to beat the unbeatable test, and he beat the test. So I don't want to spoil the movie, but that is a theme that runs through Wrath of Khan. I am somewhat of a Trekkie. No apologies. So what did I discover? Let me share with you my sort of immediate results, and then I'll share with you a little bit of my conclusions and my thoughts and observations around what I discovered. So at a high level, what I did was, in fact, I'm going to skip forward. I should really flip these slides around. As I looked at the mappings that I came up with and listed out the PCI requirements that I felt satisfied or addressed the mitigations, I came up with basically 4 different categories. The first being explicit, where the mitigation was something like, which I have samples of, but basically it was a one-to-one mapping. The mitigation is do vulnerability scanning, and PCI requires vulnerability scanning, things along those lines. The next category, what I called implicit, were they weren't verbatim, word for word, the PCI requirement mapped back to the mitigation, but if you know anything about the nature of PCI as a security framework or standard, you can sort of read between the lines and get it. These are the things that are really addressing whatever the mitigation is. So not verbatim, but fairly easy to map them and connect them all together. So I called that category implicit. The third category, and there was only a few of these, but it was mitigations that I had to really struggle to find a PCI requirement that addressed it. In some cases, it was, well, I know what they're looking for, and it's not really explicit or even implicit in the PCI requirements. But if you squint enough, the need to squint, you could kind of squeeze it into that category. The final category, which is actually the 41st mitigation, which is don't do anything. And that's a specific mitigation that the attack framework has, and their explanation is basically that the solution would be worse than the problem. So effectively, my mappings are of 40 mitigations, not 41. So back real quick to the pie chart, because I figured out how to make a pie chart in PowerPoint. I was very proud of myself. This is how it mapped out. You can see that more than half were explicit. It was just straightforward. The mitigation is exactly in the PCI standard. A good portion were implicit. You could connect the dots pretty easy. A small number where you need to squint, and then there's that one, which is don't do anything. So examples of explicit mappings, as I said, vulnerability scanning is a 1-for-1. Password policies, it's explicit because PCI has requirements for how to create passwords, secure passwords, make them complex, change them periodically, don't share them, make sure they're unique, so on and so forth. Things like antivirus, anti-malware, and disable or remove things that you're not using. Those are examples of explicit mappings. The implicit ones are things like Active Directory configuration. I mean, when PCI was first written, Active Directory, it might have existed, but it wasn't common. And there are no explicit requirements that say, configure your Active Directory a particular way. But there are certainly requirements within the PCI standard that are addressed or accomplished by configuring your Active Directory appropriately. Another one that's an interesting one is network segmentation, which is a mitigation and is very commonly done within the PCI world. But technically, network segmentation is not a PCI requirement. And that actually comes as a surprise to some people, especially even some of my PCI customers. Somewhere along the line, companies figured out, if I segment my network, you're not going to look at everything as an assessor. You're only going to look at the systems that pertain to our payment processing. And that's desirable from a security perspective because it adds layers of complexity. It's kind of a security in depth type of thing. And companies benefit from doing it, but they don't always do it for what I would say the right reason. They do it to try to reduce scope and reduce the cost and the complexity. And very often it is described as the burden of PCI, which I hear as the burden of security. But that's a torch we all bear to some degree in the cybersecurity field. And then the third category, of course, is the need to squint. Things that are, code signing, boot integrity, application isolation, and sandboxing. Great things to do, but aren't really directly addressed by any of the PCI requirements. I could, because I know PCI inside and out, could sort of thread it together, but for simplicity's sake, I found it easier just to say, yeah, that's something you just sort of need to squint at. We can say that they don't get addressed, if you will. That's fine. So in terms of the raw numbers, counting the explicit and the implicit, there's actually 35 out of the 40 mitigations that are addressed by PCI. I thought that was pretty darn good, and I think that's pretty meaningful. From a validation perspective, I think it sort of proved my point that, if you follow PCI or any security framework or standard and actually take it seriously and really do it, rather than trying to figure out a way to make sure your people, like the assessors and auditors, come in and think that you're doing it, you're really pretty well off, and you're pretty well ready to defend against real world attacks, in theory. I presented this to my team a couple months ago, and some of the questions they asked actually spurred some of these observations. But one thing that I discovered when I was going back through, obviously when I was filling out the spreadsheet, I found that I was coming up with the same there was a theme emerging in terms of some of the PCI requirements that I was listing in my mapping. In fact, I discovered that a particular requirement, which is the PCI 2.2, which is the requirement to develop configuration standards for all of your system components, that actually turned out to be listed, if not the primary, the second or third. It was listed 12 out of the 40 times. And I thought, well, that's amazing. 30% of the mitigations are addressed by just one PCI requirement. Again, PCI is, depending on how you slice it and dice it, it's somewhere between 400 and 500 specific requirements. Excuse me. So I thought that was pretty meaningful and significant. Especially because in my experience as an assessor, somebody that goes in, it's called a qualified security assessor or QSA, somebody that goes into organization and has to see how well they're doing the 400 some odd controls. Documentation is not something that's fun for anybody to do. And the idea of coming up with a configuration standard for whatever reason seems to elude the vast majority of my customers, to the point where it's kind of a paper pushing exercise. They put something together, but it tends to be put together by the auditor compliance group, and it's not necessarily a document that's used or thought of as being actionable by the teams that would actually benefit from following it. Mileage varies, but I think overall 2.2 as a requirement is something that's glossed over more times than not. This is just an example of, I counted up what were the most common. 2.2 stood out as the top one. Some of the other common requirements that if you do these, you're covering most of the MITRE attack framework. Identity and access management, which is all of requirement 8. That's where the password controls come into play. That's where making sure you're not doing much in terms of using administrative account or elevated privileges, or you're minimizing that as much as possible, so on and so forth. 6.4, having a change control process in place, keeping track of the changes that you make in your environment. Of course, 11.5 in terms of detecting attacks, that's one that came up a lot. And again, 6.3, going through a process where security is built into your software development program, which is an interesting one because the way that we do software development has changed dramatically over the last several years. I've had many conversations with people about DevOps and SecDevOps or DevSecOps and you know, the need to build security in every step of the way in a development process, which is, you know, in the traditional sense 25 years ago, where development projects, you know, were months if not year-long projects. You know, the way coding happens these days, it's so much on the fly. It's, you know, the idea of the whole life cycle of a software development can sometimes be, you know, months, if not weeks, if not days, if not hours. So lots of debate on how security plays a role in that, or should play a role in that. Probably another discussion for another day. Wanted to go back to the 2.2 requirement a little bit because I think this is probably the most significant finding I had. 30% of the requirements. Somebody had asked me, well, how many attack techniques does that represent? So I went back and actually added up all the ones that mention the specific mitigations, and it turns out there's 92 of the attack techniques that are mitigated by some of the mitigations that map to the PCI requirement 2.2. Obviously, that number has changed because there's now several hundred more sub-techniques, but my second hypothesis will be, even though they've sort of, you know, dissected and gotten more detail on the techniques, the percentage, which is, you know, just over a third of the techniques, I'm guessing that probably roughly stays the same. It's the nature of statistics, I guess. So what it boils down to is that one requirement within the PCI data security standard addresses a third of the attack techniques that are mapped in MITRE attack, which again are all real world techniques, things that are actually documented as having been used by real attackers. That was very interesting to the team that I work with at Online, which is primarily the QSA team. They were excited to be able to start using MITRE attack framework, because a lot of people have heard about it, or they've gotten pitches on it, or certainly they're talking to vendors and getting vendor pitches, and they bring MITRE attack framework up. They're anxious to be using it as part of a discussion to hammer home the idea that 2.2 is actually a very important requirement to follow and take serious in terms of all of the PCI data security standard. In other words, don't gloss over it, actually pay attention to it, because that's a third of the problem right there. So that's sort of that's sort of it in a nutshell. At the end of the day, it's not overly complicated. It was 266 techniques at the time, 40 mitigations mapping into the PCI data security standard. Just very briefly, if you want to keep in touch with me, as I said earlier, I welcome interactions with you. If you just want to hear me talk, of course, you can tune into Security and Compliance Weekly, which broadcasts live these days on Tuesdays at noon Eastern Time. You can get there by going to securityweekly.com/live. We've actually also introduced in the last couple months a Discord server, and we have almost as busy a time keeping up with the conversation on the Discord server as we do just actually broadcasting and having the interviews and the conversations on air. So it's been a really good time, and we're covering a lot of ground. The goal being, I've lived in the security world, I've lived in the compliance world, and I've noticed over the years that the two don't always work well together, and don't always know that the other side exists. But we're all in the same arena. We're all trying to accomplish the same overall goals. So we are trying to promote understanding. Our theme is we're trying to build bridges and tear down silos. So if you want to hear me on a regular basis, Tuesdays at noon. Again, here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. You can follow me on Twitter, ask me to follow back. We can DM. I've actually had people call me. I may not recognize the number, so leave me a message and I'll call you back, or simply email me. With that, I would be happy to open up the floor to questions or comments.
Thanks, Jeff. We really appreciate the talk. If you have questions, use the Q&A function on Zoom if you're able to. We'll try to monitor that in the chat as well, just to see what's going on. Let's see.
It looks like there is at least one question.
Yeah,
there is a question on the chat.
It's a long one too.
Okay.
Somebody read it. Or I'll read it.
I'll read it out loud for you if that helps.
Sure.
Okay. How does the attack framework mitigation mapping reflect the emerging compute models and configurations? That is, how the OS is virtualized with increased isolation of workloads more as a baseline enterprise, moving from the Active Directory to cloud, in-tune type services, NW segmentation for remote workers, etc.
Great question. I can't say that I honestly have a good answer for that, other than to emphasize that the attack framework is a project that Mitre keeps it going. It's always evolving and always updating. But again, emphasis being on what people are seeing in the real world, in the wild, real attacks, documented attacks from breaches and forensics exercises and stuff like that. So the impact, I'm not sure what it is, but I would guess over time, as things continue to change and move to virtualization and cloud and containers, that will eventually be reflected in the attack framework, at least as it requires new or different techniques, but to solve the problem. I don't think the tactics very much are going to change, but maybe a new tactic will emerge. Now, that notwithstanding, because I have more and more customers that are doing things in the cloud and doing things in containers and virtualized environments, I've been struggling, and my customers have been struggling with the understanding that just because they've thrown something into a cloud and they were sold on the, bring everything to us and you'll be secure. If you read the small print, most organizations are still on the hook, specifically in terms of PCI, for a lot of the requirements in the data security standard. My first exposure, and I'm not trying to disparage any company, but my first exposure was to Amazon probably 5 or 6 years ago, and AWS. And at the time, I would read all the documentation and all the fine print, and it was all there. But I know that AWS was selling services to companies that ended up being my customers that let's just say they took advantage of perhaps them not reading between the lines and understanding what wasn't being done for them. AWS has done a much better job these days. More recently, I've been working with Google Cloud, where Google Cloud puts out what's called a responsibilities matrix, and they go through specifically for PCI all the different requirements, and they say explicitly, Google does this for you, or Google can do it for you for, you know, small fee, added services, or no, this is still on you. This is still your responsibility. So that's a huge help. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem for companies that think, oh, well, we've never done security that well, so let's just flip it to the cloud because it's a secure environment and it's a huge company and all that's taken care of for us. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, but I see things getting better. You know, are the new computing models and the new way things are done, you know, they certainly address certain historical weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but hopefully SPAF would agree with me because we've been around a long time. But, you know, for every new thing that solves a problem or two or three, generally either new problems are exposed, maybe not immediately, but eventually, or you know, different existing old problems come to light that weren't necessarily thought of. So, you know, to me, it's kind of a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of scenario. That's been my experience, but go ahead, Sven.
Yeah, let me add something to this. So part of applying any framework like the attack framework to virtualized environments, you actually have to realize that you have different levels of abstraction that you have to apply. So if you've got a container, you need to apply the framework to the container and whatever's running inside the container. Then you have to apply it in the cloud environment, wherever the container is stored and served from. And you also have to apply it to the clients that are accessing. So if you try to apply it at one level of abstraction, you may miss some of the nuances of things that are underneath and not even visible to the container or to the virtualized environment. And that's a sort of a deficiency in several of these frameworks. But as you said, you know, as we add more layers, we're hiding more things that we have to keep track of.
I concur. He said it in a more academic way than I can.
We have another question that has come in on the Q&A. It says, how would you describe a false flag operation using attack?
And I have to apologize and ask, what is a false flag operation? Anyone?
Okay. Yeah, it says IE techniques there. They are the same techniques. Adam, can you open up Krasi's microphone, please?
I am just not familiar with the terminology, okay. and it's just me.
Okay, so okay, the definition, at least I'm putting behind it, is false flag operation is when an entity uses a third-party techniques or techniques that have been attributed to a third party to conduct an operation, thus making it look like it is the third party conducting the operation, not that particular entity.
I see. Okay, so sort of obfuscation, which I guess would
yes,
because would be trying to protect against attribution. I'm not sure how Mitre attack would address that, because I think they focus mostly on the techniques and not so much the origins. Certainly some of the vendors that I've talked to or that we've interviewed on the podcast would be more familiar with that, because their solutions, their tools would be designed to try to capture some of the information that might tip the scale. It's certainly not something that is either explicitly or implicitly addressed by PCI, because PCI isn't focused so much on attribution and finding out who done it, as much as it is trying to detect that it's happening and either prevent it outright or at least minimize the damage, you know, detect it early and kind of cut your losses. I will concede that PCI isn't perfect in that sense. It doesn't address everything in terms of the traditional data security triad. It doesn't really care, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's much more focused on confidentiality of credit card data, payment card data. Doesn't really care about availability. They could care less whether you as a business can conduct commerce as long as the cards are not compromised.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. I was just thinking if you, I was just asking if you had kind of thought about it, because yeah, I have not been able to describe that. And I do not know if even if I should classify this as a technique or where it's an attack, because it's more like a meta level. It's kind of like Spav mentioned, the different levels of abstraction.
Right.
This is not like you use the same techniques, but the level of abstraction is that it is, set of TTPs, but are used by somebody else to mimic another. Anyway,
Right.
I digress. Thank you.
No, it's an interesting question. It's just not something that is in my wheelhouse, because I don't deal with that very often. In terms of what I'm hearing is it's an issue about attribution.
Yeah, I see another question that has just come in. It's again a fairly long one, so I'll read this for you. It says,
Okay.
why not just use the Mitre attack framework to verify security, privacy certifications of businesses instead of PCI? From what I understand, the PCI framework is very broad, and the Mitre attack framework is more specific and actionable. Would this not be more beneficial for companies, especially forcing those who wish to put the bar as low as possible? I think this may have already been addressed in your talk. There are problems of too much or too little specificity, but I was curious.
Great question, and this is simply my opinion, but my immediate response is, why do something new when something tried and true that's been around for 16 years and has arguably impacted this industry more than just about anything out there? I mean, that's where that's where I am stuck on PCI and fall back on PCI and continue to try to find ways to advance the knowledge and understanding of PCI as a framework and not simply a something that's very broad. It's interesting that you describe it as broad, because I have alternating discussions with people that describe PCI as bare minimum. It's you need to do so much more, but then and to which I ask, well, give me a for instance, give me a what, and the intelligent answers have been more along the lines of, like you just brought up, this whole idea of attribution, kind of not in there. Availability, kind of not in there. But most people struggle with, well, it only makes you scan once a quarter. I'm like, well, that's not exactly true. They're asking you to demonstrate that you have clean scans once a quarter. And if you think that means you can get away with scanning once a quarter, somebody needs to teach you and educate you that no, scanning needs to be an ongoing program, and you have to have all sorts of processes in place to make sure you're getting those clean scans on a consistent basis. The flip side is, I and particularly when it comes to my customers that actually try to follow the PCI standard, if you're not focused and centered on security, and if it's not in your wheelhouse, you can really, really struggle. It's really hard to do what PCI requires. Not from the perspective of it's anything particularly daunting or complex. It's comprehensive in terms of it covers all the major components of what should be in a security program. What's lost and what's missing, and where I struggle with PCI in the way it's implemented, is there's too few people that can read the standard and advise their customers. It says this, but within your context, within your environment, this is really what you need to be doing. And maybe you're doing it already, and you don't know it, or you don't know that that applies here, or you're not doing it at all and you need to be doing it. So it's an interesting dichotomy. Is that the right word? I feel like I should say big words since I'm talking to an educational institution, but there's equally people out there that think it's the bare minimum, think it's too hard and too complex, and they want to simplify it. This is not a sales pitch for PCI, by the way, but it is kind of, because you know, when I hear PCI, I hear security, and that's, you know, my years and years of, you know, for everything that's out there, and the industry is always trying to come up with something new and different, some new shiny object, and that's not just products, that's also frameworks. The other problem, I guess, is there's so many companies that have to do PCI, and if you have to do PCI anyway, why not take advantage of it and use it throughout your whole enterprise? And because it's a pretty decent framework for doing all the things that you need to be doing. Yes, it requires work, especially with the new technologies and the cloud and whatnot, which is what I've been focusing on for the last year or two, is how do you translate PCI, which assumes, you know, the old networks of the days gone by, and apply the principles of the requirements, the objectives of the requirements into the new environment. That's what I find fun and challenging about it. But, you know, for everything else that comes along, it's voluntary. Nobody is required to do the Mitre attack framework. Nobody is really required outside of government, let's say, to do the NIST cybersecurity framework. You know, I talked to lots of vendors that try to apply it to the commercial world. I even had a Canadian customer, my company happens to be Canadian, that was following the Mitre cybersecurity framework. I'm like, why? You're not even in the US. I'm like, well, but somebody told us it's a great framework. I'm like, okay, but you also have to do this one. Why not start with the one you have to do instead of running around and this is my editorial, listening to the sales pitches and getting sucked in by all the gee whiz smart vendors, salespeople, and do the new shiny when there's something that's there already that's tried and true that would work for you if you just embraced it and had somebody that could effectively explain it to you and help you apply it to whatever your environment is.
You know, Jeff, you missed a chance to be cynical here.
Darn it.
Yeah, I mean, the PCI isn't really about security. It's about limiting risk.
Well, that's all of us are really doing that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's on that scale, it's more towards what can we mandate to limit risk to the credit card processors, right? Their financial risk, not necessarily all of the things, for instance, the denial of service aspect or personnel screening or any of the other things that would go towards really total security.
Right.
Those things that are going to protect their investments the most. You have two more questions and we're sort of near the end of the time.
Sure.
Is it, let's see, I'll read one of them. It's just a comment, really. It's hard to make an organization build security on a house of cards, especially contextualizing PCI towards specific organizations. The last one here, though, the last question to ask is there a framework that educational institutes such as schools should be asked to comply with, given the sudden increase in online education and the amount of kids' information available online? Is that something you've thought about at all?
Well, I can respond to both of them real quickly. To the first one, what's interesting, and it's just more of a comment back to the comment, is when PCI first came out, the way it was presented to me was this is supposed to be a measurement of a organization's security program as it applies to a particular type of data and information. And of course, it's been, what took off was, oh, we can focus on only one thing. I've always told my customers, especially when they're trying to talk me out of looking at something, what do you not want me to see? What are you not doing in terms of security in your entire environment that you don't want me to know about? Because there's very little in the PCI standard that you shouldn't be doing everywhere anyway. To the second question, I would have said PCI as a framework a year ago, because so many educational institutions, and I've worked with several over the years, have so much PCI compliance. I've worked with universities where they slice and dice their PCI compliance up, twofold, 20 folds, I think one that I talked to had like 70 or 80 different specific ways that they were doing credit cards and payment cards that they had to be compliant with, different payment processes. In the context of the new virtual world, gosh, I have no answer for that. other than maybe look at PCI. But again, PCI, I mean, PCI has in it the elements of secure remote authentication, the requirement for what I call two-factor authentication, because at the end of the day, it's two-factor authentication. You know, that again, it's one of those instances where you have to take the requirements that's there and just expand it outward to where it applies. But what are the things that we need to do secure people working virtually or studying virtually? You know, when it gets down to, you know, conceptually, you know, the security goals or requirements, there's still not a whole lot out there that hasn't already been thought of. It's just a matter of how do you apply it and how do you do it and how do you make it repeatable and affordable for the masses. I don't think it's as much a question of which framework, it's how does it scale in a way that very few organizations or people ever anticipated we would need to do this.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. There's no shortage of frameworks. We could probably fill several weeks worth of lectures of those.
Yep.
But this has been most educational. We don't really talk a lot about PCI in our courses.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to focus more on either the Mitre or the cybersecurity framework from NIST. So this was great fill in. Thank you so much for being here. And everybody be sure to tune in next week when we have another one of these talks. So
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope I didn't bore you with PCI, but it's a large part of the commercial world.
Not at all.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Have a great evening.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.